There is a psalm in the Bible that has a missing letter, and almost nobody asks why. The psalm is Psalm 145, a praise poem that follows the Hebrew alphabet one letter at a time, an acrostic where each verse begins with the next letter in sequence Aleph, Bet, Gimel, all the way to Tav. 22 letters, 22 verses, the entire alphabet pressed into the service of praise. Except the verse for Nun is not there, the letter that would come after Mem and before Samech is gone. In some ancient manuscripts, the verse has been supplied and later readers filled it in with a line about God being faithful in all his words, but the original Hebrew text of the psalm simply skips from Mem to Samech. And if you read the psalm in most English translations, you will see that missing verse. It was added from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and editors inserted it as verse 13b or sometimes as a separate line. But the Hebrew text, as it has been preserved in the Masoretic tradition, does not contain it. The psalm is incomplete. The alphabet is a whole. And the question that refuses to go away is whether that whole is a scribble accident or something the psalmist placed there on purpose. The acrostic form is not decorative. It is a deliberate act of structure, a way of saying that praise should cover everything from A to Z, from the first to the last, without omitting a single category of human speech. When a psalmist chose the acrostic, they were committing themselves to a kind of total coverage. Every letter gets a line, every sound gets a place. The reader is meant to feel the completeness of the praise, the sense that nothing has been left out. So when a letter is missing, the reader is meant to feel something else entirely. The pattern breaks, the expectation is violated. And the violation is so quiet that most people read right past it because the supplied verse in the English translation fills the gap and the psalm feels whole again. But the original Hebrew asks a different kind of attention. It asks whether praise can be complete when it is not, in fact, covering everything. The first half of the psalm builds a picture of God that is relentlessly expansive. Verse 8, the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Verse 9, the Lord is good to all, and his compassion is over all that he has made. The language is accumulation, piling up attributes, naming and renaming the character of God. The psalmist is not making a single point. They are building a wall of testimony, one stone after another. All your works shall give thanks to you, O Lord, and all your faithful shall bless you. The kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. The psalm is an exercise in exhaustive praise, and the form of the acrostic is the scaffolding that supports that claim of exhaustiveness, which is exactly why the missing letter becomes so unsettling. The form promises completeness, but the text delivers a gap. The Hebrew word most commonly used in this psalm for the praise itself is asterisk hallel asterisk, the root from which asterisk hallelujah asterisk comes. Asterisk hallel asterisk means to boast, to shine, to make a show of celebration. It is not a quiet internal feeling. It is a public, audible, sometimes even raucous declaration. And the psalm uses it repeatedly. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. I will extol you, my God and King, and bless your name forever and ever. The energy is forward, outward, upward. But the missing Nun sits in the middle of that forward motion like a stone in a stream. The reader is moving from Mem to Samech, and the word that should have been there is not there. The praise stumbles. And that stumble is the detail that changes how the whole psalm must be read. Because the Nun verse is not the only gap in the psalm. The internal logic of the acrostic in Psalm 145 is unusual in another way. It actually has a repeated letter. Verse 13 begins with Samech, then the supplied Nun is inserted, then verse 14 begins with Ayin. But in the Hebrew, after the missing Nun, the pattern continues without a break. The reader simply jumps from one letter to the next as if nothing happened. And that is the strange thing. The psalm itself does not acknowledge the loss. It does not say here is where the line should be. It just moves forward into the next letter, into the next line of praise. The psalmist acts as if the alphabet is still intact. And that is either the result of a copyist's mistake that the tradition refused to correct, or it is a deliberate silence that holds more meaning than a filled-in line ever could. The majority of critical scholarship says the Nun verse is a scribble error, a line that dropped out of the Hebrew tradition early on and was later restored from the Greek. The Septuagint has a verse between verse 13 and 14 that reads, "The Lord is faithful in all his words and gracious in all his deeds." That line appears in many English translations as the second half of verse 13, and it is a perfectly good line, theologically sound, metrically appropriate. It belongs, but the Hebrew manuscripts do not have it. And that absence has been noted for centuries by Jewish commentators, some of whom suggest the missing nun is actually a reference to the fall of Jerusalem, that the nun stands for *Nephilah*, falling, and that the psalm intentionally omits it because in the time of exile the falling of the people cannot be sung as praise. Others point to the word *Nophil*, meaning fallen, and note that the psalm does not want to include the fall of the wicked or the fallen state of Israel in its acrostic of praise. The gap itself becomes a theological gesture, a space where the psalmist refuses to put a word because the word would be wrong. For the reader sitting with this psalm today, that gap is not an antiquarian oddity. It is a mirror. You have a life that is supposed to be complete, a praise that is supposed to cover everything, every circumstance, every disappointment, every silence of God. You have a faith that tells you to bless the Lord at all times, to let everything that has breath praise the Lord, to give thanks in all circumstances. And then there is the thing you cannot put into that acrostic. There is the loss, the betrayal, the diagnosis, the silence, the day when you opened your mouth to bless God and the word was not there. And the text of the psalm says that gap belongs in the psalm. The missing letter is not an error that needs to be corrected. It is a permission. The psalm knows that there are lines of praise that cannot be sung, that the alphabet of human experience does not have a letter for every wound. And the psalm does not pretend otherwise. The missing nun is not a mistake. It is the most honest part of the psalm. The psalmist built a structure that promises total coverage and then left one slot empty, as if to say that even the most complete praise we can offer will always have a gap where a word should be. And that gap is not a failure of faith. It is an admission that the praise is not about our completeness, but about God's. The psalm will go on to say in the verses that follow that the eyes of all look to God and he gives them their food in due season, that he opens his hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing. The gap does not stop the provision. The missing line does not break the acrostic so badly that the psalm falls apart. It continues. The praise continues. The hand still opens. And that is the tension the psalm leaves unresolved. If the missing nun is a space where the psalmist refused to put a word, what word is the psalmist expecting God to put there instead? It is a question the psalm itself does not answer with a word, because the answer is not a word. The psalm moves past the gap, past the missing nun, and lands on verse 15, which in the Hebrew begins with ayin, the eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food in due season. That is where the acrostic picks up after the break. And the verb for look to is the Hebrew *sabar*, which does not simply mean to glance or to see. It means to wait with expectation, to strain towards something, to fix your attention on a source of supply. It is the same root that appears in the word for hope, and it carries the connotation of a watchman scanning the horizon for a ship or a farmer watching the sky for rain. The eyes of all *saber* to you. The posture is not passive. It is a sustained, intentional orientation of the whole person toward the one who provides. And what happens when the eyes fix on God? The next verb is *natin*, he gives. He opens his hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing. The hand is opened, the Hebrew *patach*, which means to unfurl, to release, to make accessible. In the ancient Near East, the image of an open hand was the image of a king who provides for his people. But here it is not a king in a palace, not a ruler dispensing from a distance. It is God, and the hand is not clenched, not withholding, not closed in judgment. The hand is open and the giving is continuous, present tense, a perpetual flow. The gap in the acrostic is surrounded by this reality. The missing letter sits between verses about God's compassion over all creation and verses about the eyes of all creation looking to that open hand. The gap does not interrupt the giving. It is surrounded by it. This changes how the missing nun must be read. If the gap were a scribble error, it would be a mistake that happens to sit in the most theologically charged position possible, right between the declaration of God's goodness and the description of God's provision. But if the gap is intentional, it becomes the most precise theological statement in the psalm. The missing letter is the space where human words run out. The praise that was supposed to cover everything reaches the letter none and finds nothing to say. And instead of forcing a word, instead of manufacturing a line, the psalmist leaves it empty. The gap is the place where the psalm admits that there are things for which no human language is adequate. Not because they are too terrible to speak, but because they are too dependent on God to be named by us. The only thing that can fill that gap is not a word from the psalmist. It is a hand from heaven. The cultural background of this psalm deepens the point. Psalm 145 is the only psalm in the entire Psalter that is explicitly titled *Tehillah*, a praise. It is the signature of David, and it is placed at the climax of the final collection of Davidic psalms in the book. This is not a casual poem. It is a summary, a capstone, a deliberate attempt to gather all the strands of praise into one final acrostic. In Jewish tradition, this psalm is recited 3 times daily in the liturgy, and the rabbis taught that anyone who recites it 3 times a day is assured of a share in the world to come. The missing nun has been discussed in rabbinic literature for centuries. One tradition says that the nun was omitted because it begins the word *nafal*, fallen, and the psalmist did not want to include the fall of Israel in the praise. Another tradition says the missing nun is a reference to the *Nephilah* of the wicked, and the psalm leaves that letter out because the fall of the wicked is not a cause for praise. But there is a third tradition, less quoted, that says the nun is missing because it represents *Nephilat apayim*, falling on one's face in prostration. The missing letter is not an omission of something bad. It is the space where the worshiper stops speaking and falls silent. The missing letter is the place where words end and the body takes over. The praise of the tongue gives way to the praise of the posture. That is a different way of thinking about the gap. Not as a failure of praise, but as its highest expression. You have had moments in your own life when words were inadequate. A diagnosis, a death, a betrayal, a silence from God that lasted so long you stopped checking for a reply. And you tried to pray. You tried to give thanks. You opened your mouth and the words were not there. The acrostic of your life had a missing letter and you could not force it. The psalm says do not force it. The gap belongs. The praise does not require a full alphabet from you. It requires that your eyes continue to saber to wait with expectation on the one whose hand is open. The missing line is not a deficit in your faith. It is the evidence that your faith has moved beyond language into trust. The psalm continues after verse 15 with a series of statements that build on this trust. Verse 16, you open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. The Hebrew word for desire is *ratzin*, which can also mean pleasure, favor, goodwill. It is not just a basic need being met. It is the satisfaction of what the creature most deeply wants. And the verb *sabar*, to look with expectation, appears in a different form in verse 15, but the root echoes through the rest of the psalm. The word for hope in Hebrew is *tikva*, from the same root as *kava*, to wait. The psalm is building a vocabulary of dependency. The whole creation is oriented toward God, waiting, looking, expecting. And the answer is not a doctrine. The answer is an open hand. For the reader, this becomes a practical discipline. The missing nun is not just a textual curiosity. It is a question put directly to you. What word would you put in the gap? What is the thing you cannot say right now? What is the loss, the disappointment, the betrayal that you have never been able to include in your praise? The psalm says you do not have to include it as a word. You can include it as a space. You can leave it empty and let God's hand fill it. The completeness of the acrostic is not your responsibility. The completeness of the provision is God's. You do not need to supply every letter. You only need to keep your eyes fixed on the one who supplies everything else. The psalm ends as it must with a final verse, verse 21, my mouth will speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. The acrostic completes its circuit. The letters from Aleph to Tav are all present except for that one missing nun. And the final verse, the Tav verse, brings the psalm to a close, not with a complaint about the gap, but with a commitment to praise. The psalmist does not say, except for the letter I could not write. The psalmist says, my mouth will speak. The gap is not even mentioned. It is simply there, unresolved, unmentioned, and completely surrounded by the reality of God's faithfulness. That is the weight of it. The missing letter is not something to fix, not something to explain away, not something to be ashamed of. It is the part of the psalm that you do not have to complete because God already has. The final paragraph, the missing nun, is the most honest verse you will never read. It does not say that God will fill every gap. It says that the gap itself is a kind of praise, the praise of the creature who has run out of words and still looks. The open hand does not require a complete alphabet. It only requires that your eyes are still fixed on the one who opens it. And that is the heaviest truth the psalm produces. The word you cannot say is not the end of your praise. It is the beginning of your trust.